Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ian Watt, and I'm the General Manager of the CMS Group, the company behind SmartSpec. And I'm pleased to be joined here today by our representative from Auckland Council. I'd like to introduce Jock Hyde, a Manager for Project Assessment in Auckland South. Thanks, Jock, for being with us today. Really appreciate your time.
Happy to be here.
As we all know, today is a look into feedback and observation so far from Auckland Council in regards to the new H1 requirements. I know that our SmartSpec team has been inundated with questions on this topic, and today we're going to try and get to as many of them as we can. But I am going to apologise in advance if we don't get to some of your questions out there. There was simply too many for us to be able to address all of them. And also a lot of the questions did ask about specific product recommendations and manufacturer related guidance. And unfortunately, that's not something that Council can provide guidance on. Obviously, they can't risk being seen as endorsing a particular supplier. And so what SmartSpec has decided to do is follow up some of those product related questions in subsequent webinars, which will address some of the key areas that a lot of your questions related to, certainly around the areas of insulation, doors and window joinery, foundations, etc. So look out for more information on those product specific follow-up spin-offs to these H1 webinars in the coming weeks and months. Right, without further ado, let's get into your questions and put them to Jock. Our first one here, Jock, what is if consent was submitted using the old formula before the cutoff date, then the RFIs or consent times would take them over the building consent deadline. So will the plans still be accepted?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ian, and it's something that comes up that's not only relevant to the H1 changes, but it's actually relevant to any change. So whenever any of you out there are making building consent applications, whatever you put down as your means of compliance, at that point in time when you make the application, when it's lodged with a council or a building consent authority of some description anywhere in the country, at that point in time, that is the method that is relevant. So if you supply your building consent application prior to May this year with the last round of changes with H1, AS1, then the previous rules apply. If you cross over, you don't have to upgrade anything suddenly because you've crossed over a date. And that happens all the way through. That doesn't matter if it's with a building consent application. It doesn't matter if it's during the inspection phase. So if documents change during the inspection phase and an inspector anywhere happens to say, oh, you should have done this, or you should have done that, if that wasn't relevant at the time your consent was lodged, then they don't have to upgrade anything.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that question. Our next one here is, do we need to include the brand's H1 house insulation guide pages with the building consent application, or only the schedule calculation method pages?
Again, a good question. You may end up having to supply all of them. And the reason that I say supply all of them, and the brand stuff there in terms of the installation guide is very useful for not just showing somebody how the R values were calculated or how they work for different building elements. There's two parts to it. So when you're making the building consent application and you're talking about H1, you probably have gone down one of three pathways. You're probably going to use what they call the schedule method, the calculation method, or you may use a modeling method. Now, what they do is just on a piece of paper show somebody that the calculations stack up. So you've met a performance metric.
Sure.
The added advantage of some of the brand stuff, if I was advocating for some of the brand stuff, but there are other suppliers of information, other sources, is that sometimes they include nice little pictorial details of the construction component, whether it be a slab edge, a roof edge, a wall assembly. That helps for anybody, even the contractor on site, get some visualization of what they're trying to apply. So you might have to supply all of it, but ultimately, whether it's a brand's detail or not, you've got your calculations, your schedule method, whatever it happens to be. The important part is that you follow that up with an actual instruction to build. All of the calculations are not going to be used on site. If I'm a builder on site, what I want to be able to see on a set of plans, rather than an R6.6 or a 0.4 this or a 1.9 that, I want to see how I build it. So the most important part is supplying a pictorial representation of that instruction to build.
Right. Okay. How is the raft slab to be broken and insulated under the internal garage wall at the thermal break of the building?
That's again another good question. It would be lovely if, when the compliance documents were rewritten, that they included design details for every single scenario, but they don't. So we've got to look in other places for those designs. So, for example, you could decide to make, this is for an integral garage, you could decide to just make the entire building envelope the H1 envelope. So rather than create a demarcation point traditionally along that internal garage wall, the one you get out of the car and walk through the kitchen, rather than do that, you could just elect to make the entire perimeter.
Sure.
And then you could include the slab, because doing it without slab edge insulation now is actually quite difficult. But should you wish to do so, you could just make the entire envelope the H1 envelope. Yes, that has challenges in terms of what I do about the garage door, but there are ways to solve that. Other countries have solved it who have much higher insulation requirements than we do. Alternatively, you could say to your structural engineer, if you have, let's face it, most construction now revolves around raft slabs. If it's a raft slab, it's already structurally engineered as opposed to an NZS 3604 solution. You could say to your structural engineer, look, I still want to make the thermal break along this line. How is that going to affect the ribs, the thickness? How's the slab going to work? So they could come up with a solution for you for that. So there are lots of ways of doing it, but ultimately the choice is yours about where you want to make that thermal break occur.
Are you seeing more construction companies include the garage in that envelope, or it's still generally excluded?
Generally excluded at this point, but I think it's because it's been deemed, well, a little bit it's because it's been deemed too hard, but only too hard because we don't really have the experience of dealing with it. Do a Google search, you can find the ways they do it in North America, the way they do it in Europe, the way they do it in Australia. There are lots of ways, excuse me, there are lots of ways to do with it and make your garage part of that thermal envelope. You usually still have to do something anyway, because you've got a ceiling in your garage. So if you decide to break it, you've got challenges above the wall in the garage as well, going up to the roof. It almost makes it so much work in that internal wall that it's just about as simple to make everything the thermal envelope. And ultimately, I think we've got to ask ourselves, what is it we're really trying to achieve here, and what were the reasons for the H1 changes? The H1 changes weren't just somebody deciding to make a builder or a designer's life harder. They were critical for all sorts of reasons. As a country, New Zealand has to meet its greenhouse gas emissions targets. So part of the H1 changes were really to try and drive down the amount of energy that we use so that we can contribute to that. So, you know, there's a much bigger aspiration here than just whether or not we insulate a garage ceiling.
And generally, I guess the garage is obviously a significant additional space that could be utilized for other purposes than just storing cars.
Yes, absolutely.
Our next one here is the full heat modeling versus a calculation method versus the schedule method. Trying to understand if these are all still viable to use.
Yeah, they are. I think there's a misperception here that somehow these things vanished or changed. They really didn't change. The compliance pathways, as in a schedule method, a calculation method, a modeling method, were always there. All that's really happened with the H1 changes is they've taken certain standards that used to be cited. So you'd have H1 and you'd be flicking through pages and it would tell you to go to a certain standard to find out how to calculate X, Y, Z. All that has really been done at a high level is we've taken all the best bits from those standards and put them all into the compliance document solutions.
Yes. To
make it easier to just access the information there in the document. So they're all still valid to the same degree as they were valid previously.
Okay. We spoke about the garage before. How should the internal garage door be treated when the internal wall is part of the thermal envelope?
The most simplistic way to put that is if we're assuming that the garage itself is not part of the thermal envelope, as in the door is going to be up all the time, then really what I would suggest is you just treat it as if it's part of the external wall.
Yeah.
What would you do if it was an external door on an external wall? Because effectively all you're doing, if we just imagine sawing through the building at that line and throwing the garage away, now all you've got is an external wall. So what would you do on the external wall on the other three elevations? Apply the same principles, and that's what you should be doing.
Okay. Can you please define embedded heating under the H1 legislation?
I can. The definition of an embedded heating system is actually contained inside the compliance document. So when you read into the definition section that precedes usually what the acceptable solution and the verification method in any compliance document, you find in the definitions that it talks about what an embedded heating system is. And in simple terms, it's just if you look at the ceiling, look at the wall, or look at the floor, and you have embedded anything within those elements that artificially controls the temperature of your space, that's an embedded heating system.
Okay. A lot of questions were received around how H1 differs and how it's treated or processed by council, the requirements, etc., to what extent for renovations, additions and alterations as per the Building Act or H1AS1.
Yeah.
What could you say about how the council are applying the process for renovations and alterations?
I'll try to keep this in very simple terms rather than getting too wordy about it and too legalese about it. But when we alter any building, there's a certain two parts of the Building Act principally that apply. One, which most of your audience out here are familiar with, which is section 17, that says all building work must comply with the building code. That can be overused or confused when you take it out of context with an alteration. Now, what section 112 of the Building Act says is when you're looking at altering an existing building, there are certain things that we're expected to upgrade to a better standard to improve our building stock.
Yes.
They tend to only be access and facilities for people with disabilities and means of escape from fire. So it doesn't talk about upgrading insulation or weather tightness or anything like that.
Right.
But what that section of the Building Act says is, as part of your design, once you're altering the building, what you can't do is make whatever level of compliance that space had previously worse.
Right.
Now, to you and me, it means if we're sitting in this space today and we've got the heating on and you've got your normal power bill that you know what you pay every month, and we sit here in a shirt or a t-shirt, then you do an alteration and suddenly we're sitting here and I'm cold. I'll have to put on a jacket. I have to put in another heating source. I feel worse. My space is performing worse.
Right.
You can't make it perform worse. So one of the things that you have to do when you're looking at altering something is do effectively a calculation of the existing space and then a calculation of this new space, either with the addition or the alteration. So if it only had let's say it had a score of 2 out of 10 before you did the alteration, and you recalculate it and it's 1 out of 10, even though you've added in things like a bit of double glazing or some insulation in the ceiling. But if because you've changed the parameters of the geometry of the space, it now performs worse, even though you've added in these other little things, you can't do that. You're going to have to go back and think what else you can improve. So you can't make it worse. It can stay the same, but it can't be made worse.
Okay. So a lot of the common questions were about replacing the doors and windows, for example, and swap out to more modern technology around doors and windows. So the requirements there would
generally speaking is that you can't make it worse. So let's say, for example, you had this space in the office that we've got here, and you want to extend it 4 meters to be your new kitchen space or your new living space. And the discussion is, well, this is all single glazed. I just want to use single glazed in that section.
Yes.
If you do the calculations and you've added in other things like underfloor insulation or ceiling insulation or wall insulation, and you can show that even by putting in the single glazing, that the performance is enhanced or
Yes.
no worse, then as long as you articulate that in the bit of paper that you give to the council, hi, this is my design, these are my assumptions, here's a summary of how I did it, you should be fine, because you're not making it worse than before.
So
You
as long as our improvements are going backwards.
Yeah, as long as you're not going backwards, yeah, that's the key thing. So if you just hand in a design and you just hand in your H1 calculations for the new bit, and you don't look at the overall space. So if all you do is the 20 square meter extension, and you don't show how you've now recalculated the whole space to show that the whole space isn't worse,
right,
then you're going to at least get a request for further information, and let's face it, who needs those? So think about it holistically. The Act says that you can't make it worse, so you have to look at the whole thing, not just the bit. And
that's still the whole house, not just the
No,
room that's been renovated?
No, it can just be the space, because effectively the space is one component of the whole house. If you can show that extended living area now performs no worse, then by default the house can't perform any worse.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Very good. What about for historic heritage buildings? What are the H1 considerations? How do they function alongside obviously trying to protect the integrity of historic buildings?
Yeah, that's a good point as well. So first of all, because we're talking about historic buildings, we're talking about something that's existing. So straight away we've got some advantages there, because we've got this section 112 of the Building Act, so you can't make it worse. So that's straight away a benefit. You can't make it worse. There are some anomalies, is one way of putting it. Not all legislation seems to work hand in glove. If I do this with this bit of legislation, I immediately won't contravene that. Sometimes that doesn't work. So for example, if you were doing work on a historic building, whether it be a house or a commercial structure of some description, and whether it be the Historic Places Trust, or whether it be the heritage team at a council, if it's an Auckland Council, or any other council in the country, and they say, well, you can't use that window, you need to use these windows because this is what's part of the planning. And as a designer, you said, well, I can't meet the H1 requirements because of X, Y, Z. Then at that point, I guess there's several pathways that potentially you could go down. It depends greatly how you articulate your reasoning to somebody who sits on the other side of a computer somewhere where you might not have met. I'd encourage everybody to actually go to a council or a building consent authority and talk like this. These are the challenges. What can we do? So many of these things can be solved if you talk about it up front. So if the historic building offers these challenges up, first of all, you could just go through the exercise of showing that it's not any worse based on its previous performance. Secondly, you could upgrade parts of it that weren't affected by the historic requirements of the building. So there could be components of the building that aren't governed. So you might have problems with your windows, but you might be able to introduce something else in terms of energy loss mitigation that would offset the window. That's another possibility. Okay. And the last potential possibility I can think of really off the cuff is that you could apply for a waiver or a modification of certain components of H1 and say, look, I need to modify this requirement or waive this requirement because I can't do it because it breaches this other legislation. If you tie that in together by showing that the performance isn't really negatively affected, and ideally you negotiate that before your building consent application, so you're not waiting 20 days for it, yes, you probably get a better outcome.
So that collaboration with council around any of those unique or complex situations, given the type of building, can go a long way to that application. Yeah.
The big benefit is also as a designer out there is understanding that section 112 of the Building Act is be all wordy and legalese about it. But if you read and understand section 112, there are a lot of tools in there that give you the power to advocate in a perfectly valid way for why something is still okay. If you understand the wording in that section and you put that together in your application, you're highly likely to get it through.
Right. Okay. No. What about the H1 requirements for commercial projects such as offices?
Yep. Well, offices, office buildings are a challenge. Again, without getting into too much detail here, there are solutions already contained in the compliance documents. So you have your modeling method, your scheduling, your calculation method for buildings that are greater than 300 square meters. You've also got the new H1 VM3, which is the air conditioning sort of section of that component. You've got requirements for hot water systems, but commercial buildings do offer some challenges, but there are solutions there. Probably the biggest challenge for people, if you're building a new office building, is going to be when you're trying to combine it with various uses. A bit of it's commercial, but you want a bit of it to be residential. So mixed use is probably a little bit of a challenge in terms of that energy balancing. Or some, if you really want to future-proof it and you're creating an office building that you think, well, I'm going to hang on to this and lease it out. Later on, if residential, if the demand for residential apartment building complexes picks up, how do I future-proof my building now so that if I go through a change of use, I'm not suddenly going to have to strip all my exterior cladding off.
So you're just treating the zones differently and how you would address the application of it?
Yeah. So there are solutions in there. It doesn't really matter whether it's a commercial building or a residential building. H1 has your compliance pathways. You can pick whichever one suits you. Now, for a lot of commercial buildings, modeling is going to be the way to go. You're going to have to model it. It's going to be the simplest way to get things that don't otherwise, they're not otherwise a square peg going to fit in a square hole. You are going to have to model some of the solutions. But ultimately speaking, again, for commercial buildings, with things like energy renewability or energy costs, rather than thinking short term, and this has been proven over and over again overseas, is that by actually investing in more than the minimum in terms of reducing energy requirements, you actually get that return on investment.
Sure.
It's well established in Australia, it's well established overseas, that you get a proportionate increase in your resale value or what you can charge out because of the reduction in those energy costs. So as long as you go, what I would suggest is as long as you go for where the bar is set at a minimum, you'll probably get an equal and opposite return on that investment.
For sure. What do you see as the responsibilities of product suppliers to assist architects and designers around compliance?
Yep. Well, I suppose one way to put this is for an architect or for a building consent authority processor, because effectively they're the same people, you're both looking at an architectural design. What you want from a product supplier, and this is sort of discussed fairly well without minutiae levels of detail in section 14G of the Building Act, is if I want to buy your product, I want to go onto your website, download your product literature, and when I open the first page early on, I want to see your product technical statement is one way of describing it, that tells me how your product complies with, in our case, the New Zealand Building Code. They are obliged to do that, but how well they do that, where they put it, not hide it, but how well they articulate that can be a problem. But in terms of product manufacturers, they are obliged under the Building Act now to supply that information. Like labeling on a jar of food. Tell us what's in the tin. Now, the easier the product manufacturer does that, the easier it is for the architect to just go boom, hit it in selections and bang it in your product spec. The easier it is for a processor to very quickly go, oh, that's how it complies. All good. So it is legislated. They do have to supply that.
But it's made it clear and succinct for our users to be able to find it.
It's just
everyone excels at.
It's just to risk people. You know, whether you're cooking a cake or whether you're building a building, both just require a recipe book. If you make it really clear what the ingredients are and what the end result's going to be, you're going to be fine. The harder you make it to figure that out and leave it to the architect to come up with some sort of war and peace statement about how he thinks or she thinks it complies, the more difficult it is for everybody.
Just out of interest around that, we find a lot of submissions very heavy in technical information, and I guess that can bog down the processing time for council when there's too much information to be able to wade through versus the specific site material perhaps you're looking for a project. Is that part of that message as well? I suppose just being succinct around the technical information council are looking for, but also relevant to the site and the project type.
Yes, yeah, it is. And I wish I could give you a black and white answer on this because the waters are muddy. And basically what you're saying to me is how much is enough?
Yeah, because some people just believe chuck in everything and then we're covered. Because but then I imagine that could slow down your processing time because there's too much information to be able to wade through.
Oh, look, absolutely. If I'm looking at a product specification, let's face it, let's look at the way that why the building consenting system is designed the way that it is, and why, as a designer, you have to supply X, Y, Z. The biggest reason is that so when it gets to the building site, the people who have to pick up those plans and specifications find them easy to follow, know exactly what product that they're going to use, and can look at some sort of instruction on how to install it. Right. Now, simply put, that's exactly how it's supposed to work. All the other guff that's in there is that if something goes wrong, somebody can do some sort of forensic analysis of whether there was something wrong with the way I made a decision, the way you selected a product, or the way the manufacturer actually manufactured the product. Sure. But the only requirement is, for example, the Building Act says, if you can pick up a set of plans and specifications and follow it from end to end, and the end result is that the building code, the building that you build is highly likely to comply with the building code, that's the only requirement. Yes. Once you add stuff to that that's excessive, you, in my opinion, start to make it less likely that your building will comply with the building code. Right. So we've got to the stage now that a council will generally not want to come back to an architect and say, you've given me too much, because that is not the regulator's job. They might like to do that, but they tend to stay away from it. Sure. So the argument could be made that if on my simple house that's 80 square meters that involves 20 building products, that if you give me a 2,000 page specification, that the builder on site is just not going to go through 2,000 pages.
No, I think it's hard enough to read the specs as it is sometimes.
And I know that, and you know that.
Yes.
So there's two key parts to this. First of all, put as much as you can in the plans as an instruction to build. If I need it, if you were building it at home tomorrow, how much can you just get from going through the plans? Yes. More often than not, with the selection, the details in there, plans are going to do most of the job. Some of the small stuff might need to just be contained in the product specification, but it should be limited. Yes. And you should go to the effort of not sending in a product specification that is 70% irrelevant to your project, just because it is something that is in a software package. You should strip it out, just use the bits that you need for your building, and in there put in your product selections for that building. When you have the product selection, so let's say, for example, I'll pick a fire rated solution from a product manufacturer. If you can reduce their product literature with your application to a summary of how it complies with the building code, as in it's been tested to this, this, and this, usually the first couple of pages in a product literature statement from the manufacturer. And then you have selected the solution for your firewall, just give the solution for that firewall with the product technical statement. You don't need to give the 130-page document. The more you do that, the less, first of all, it's more confusing. And secondly, the less likely it is to be successful on site. Be product specific, keep the recipe simple.
Product and site, I imagine, too.
Yep.
Different climate zones and all the other opinion factors as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. How should our users demonstrate the performance or compliance? So things like Windows for processors to confirm.
If it's going to be for a processor, you're just going to go through that, what I talked about earlier on. You're going to decide what your compliance pathway is, that lovely wordy statement. Decide what you want to use. Are you going to use H1, AS1, AS2, VM1, 4, 5, 6, 8, whatever it happens to be? You decide that. Then you supply those things that we talked about earlier on. Is it just the schedule method, which is nice and easy, or do you need to do some calculations, or did you do some modeling? So you supply that stuff with the instructions to build, as in, how do I install the insulation that you've selected on my plan on that roof edge? What do I do there? Do I make it 2 layers? Do I make it 1 layer? Do I change from mineral wool insulation, which is really bulky, and I use a different product for the roof edge, which is much thinner, fits in the space, but has the same R value?
Yes.
So those are the instructions to build that the people need on site. For a processor, they need to see that so that they know it can be followed, because the builder isn't going to pick up your calculation sheet. They're not interested, and they won't know what it means.
Yes.
So there's 2 parts you need. You need the instruction to build, and the rest of it, your paperwork validates that your solution complies. That's what you need for the processor. Added to that, we talked earlier on about if it was an alteration to an existing building, you would justify how you hadn't made compliance worse.
Yes. We spoke about that earlier off camera about how there's new products and innovation. So obviously meet and go hand in hand with the H1 requirements. But maybe it's something that users or construction companies aren't as familiar with, and the products are out there, and product manufacturers have done a lot of work in technology advancements to comply.
Yeah.
So maybe it's researching those latest products to find how they fit in with the systems and the requirements of H1.
Absolutely. Don't leave it to the best thing I can always advocate for any designer is just put yourself in the shoes of the person who has to build it on site. If you can not go to your plan and see an instruction how to install that, then they're probably going to get it wrong on site. They're probably going to guess. So if all you put down is, for example, 2 layers of 3.6 or 3.2 mineral wool insulation, and you don't instruct the contractor on site with your 10-degree roof pitch what they do out there, and they just smash it all in with a stick, because they didn't know any better, then you're going to end up with failed inspections, and who needs it? So you have to do both parts for that processing side of things.
Excellent.
But there's plenty of products out there that you don't need to start worrying about all that.
Yes, and again, a lot of your queries that came in were related to product-specific matters. So the team at SmartSpec are working hard to address that. And as I said earlier, we're going to have some spin-off webinars coming up, which will focus on some of the specific areas, mainly around insulation, windows and door joinery, and also for foundation. So look out for further information on those webinars in the weeks and months to come, because we will be backing up today's segment with some product-specific information and guidance as to solutions that you can use for some of the problems that you emailed in that you're having with some of your design and on-site. That's about all the time we have today available for your questions. Thank you very much, Jock, for coming in. Look forward to speaking to you again some point in the future. And I want to thank everyone out there for their time, and enjoy the rest of your day from all the team here at SmartSpec. Thanks very much for your support, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Take care and have a great day.